September 14, 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The transport truck rumbled through the pine forest of southern Mississippi, carrying cargo that would change the lives of everyone it touched. Inside sat 23 German women, members of the Kriegshelferinnen, the Women's War Helper Corps, captured during the Allied advance through France. Their gray auxiliary uniforms were torn and stained from weeks of transit across the Atlantic. Their faces reflected exhaustion, fear, and a stubborn pride that refused to acknowledge defeat. Among them was 24-year-old Greta Hoffmann from Munich, a former radio operator who had joined the Corps in 1942, believing she was defending her homeland from barbaric invaders. She clutched a small tin containing a photograph of her family, the only possession she had managed to keep through her capture and the long journey to America. Beside her sat Liesl Weber, 19 years old, from a small village outside Hamburg. She had worked as a typist for Wehrmacht officers, translating intercepted communications. Her hands still trembled from the shock of capture, from the realization that everything she had been taught about American soldiers had prepared her for brutality and violence, not for the strange courtesy with which they had actually treated her. The truck slowed as it approached the gates of Camp Shelby. Through the canvas covering, the women caught glimpses of their new reality. Rows of neat barracks stretched across cleared land. American soldiers walked with an ease that seemed almost casual compared to the rigid military bearing the women had known in German service. Everything looked clean, organized, and surprisingly calm. Captain James Morrison, a 32-year-old officer from Georgia who had been assigned to oversee the women's section of the camp, stood waiting at the processing area. He had received his orders with mixed feelings. The United States had captured thousands of German soldiers, but female prisoners remained rare and complicated. There were no established protocols, no clear guidelines for how to handle women who had served the enemy war machine. The truck came to a stop and the canvas flap was pulled back. Sunlight flooded the dim interior, causing the women to squint and shield their eyes. They climbed down slowly, their legs stiff from hours of travel, their eyes darting nervously around the compound. American soldiers watched from a respectful distance, their expressions curious rather than hostile. Greta was struck immediately by how young many of the guards looked. Boys, really, not much older than her younger brother Klaus. She had expected hardened veterans with hatred in their eyes. Instead, she saw uncertainty, even awkwardness, as if these American soldiers were as unsure about this situation as the prisoners themselves. Captain Morrison stepped forward and addressed them through an interpreter, a middle-aged German-American, corporal named Heinrich Bauer. His words were formal but not cruel, explaining the camp rules and what would be expected of them. The women listened in silence, trying to process this strange new world where their enemies spoke of rules and routines rather than punishment and revenge. As they were led toward their assigned barracks, none of them could have imagined what awaited them in the camp mess hall, or how a simple meal would begin to unravel everything they thought they knew about America and Americans. The barracks assigned to the German women was a long wooden structure with rows of metal cots on either side. It was sparse but clean, far better than the conditions many of them had endured during their final weeks in Europe. Each woman received a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a small footlocker for personal belongings. Most had nothing to put inside except the clothes they wore and a few scraps of paper, letters from home that had found them before their capture. Greta claimed a cot near the window, wanting to see outside, to maintain some connection with the world beyond the barracks walls. Liesl took the cot beside her, grateful to stay close to someone who seemed to possess a calm strength she herself lacked. The other women settled in with minimal conversation, speaking only in hushed German when necessary. They moved with the mechanical precision of people too exhausted and overwhelmed to process their emotions. As evening approached, a bell rang across the compound. Corporal Bauer appeared at the barracks door and announced in German that it was time for the evening meal. The women exchanged nervous glances. They had been fed minimal rations during their journey, mostly bread and thin soup. Their expectations for prison food were low, shaped by stories they had heard about how the Allies treated their captives. They formed a line and walked toward the mess hall, a large building at the center of the compound. American soldiers moved in the same direction, their conversations and laughter carrying across the warm evening air. The contrast was jarring. These men seemed relaxed, almost carefree, while the German women walked in tense silence, bracing themselves for whatever degradation or deprivation awaited them inside. The mess hall doors opened, and the women stepped into a space that defied everything they had anticipated. Long tables filled the room, already occupied by American soldiers who glanced up with curiosity, but without obvious hostility. The air carried smells that were foreign yet unmistakably appetizing, rich and savory aromas that made empty stomachs clench with sudden hunger. A serving line had been set up along one wall. American kitchen staff, including several black soldiers, which many of the German women had never seen before, stood ready with serving utensils. Captain Morrison gestured for the women to join the line, to take trays, and move through just as the American soldiers did. Greta stepped forward first, her natural leadership asserting itself even in captivity. She picked up a metal tray, noting its weight and durability. These were not the thin tin plates she had expected. As she moved down the line, kitchen staff placed food on her tray without comment, without ceremony, but also without the contempt she had braced herself to receive. When she reached the end of the line and looked down at her tray, her breath caught in her throat. What she saw there would become the first crack in the wall of everything she believed about her enemies and about the war she thought she had been fighting. Greta stared at her tray in disbelief. Piled high were portions that seemed impossibly generous for prison rations. There was meat, actual meat, golden brown and glistening with what appeared to be some kind of coating. Beside it sat mashed potatoes with a pool of rich brown gravy, green beans that looked fresh rather than from a tin, and a thick slice of white bread with a pat of butter. Her mind struggled to reconcile what her eyes were seeing with what she had been taught about American treatment of prisoners. Behind her, Liesel made a small sound of surprise when she received her own tray. The other women moved through the line in stunned silence, each receiving the same generous portions. They gathered at a table near the back of the mess hall, as far from the American soldiers as possible, and sat down with their trays before them like offerings they did not quite believe they were allowed to accept. No one moved to eat at first. They simply stared at the food, waiting for some trick to reveal itself, some cruelty to emerge from this apparent kindness. Greta picked up her fork with trembling fingers. She had not held proper silverware in months. During the chaos of retreat and capture, meals had been eaten with hands or crude utensils, if meals came at all. The weight of the fork felt strange, almost formal, as if she were sitting down to dinner in her mother's house in Munich rather than in an enemy prison camp. She cut a small piece of the meat and brought it to her mouth. The moment it touched her tongue, her eyes widened. It was chicken, she realized, but unlike any chicken she had ever tasted. The outside was crispy and seasoned with flavors she could not identify. Salt and pepper certainly, but other spices that created a complexity she had never experienced in German cooking. The inside was tender and moist, practically melting in her mouth. For a moment she forgot where she was, forgot that she was a prisoner, forgot everything except the extraordinary taste filling her senses. Across the table, Liesel took her first bite, and tears began streaming down her face. She was not crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of eating real food after so long without it, and from the confusion of receiving such food from people she had been taught to hate and fear. One by one, the other women began to eat. The mess hall, filled with the quiet sounds of forks on metal trays, of women rediscovering what it meant to have full stomachs. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly, as if afraid the food might be taken away before they could finish. Captain Morrison watched from across the room, his own dinner forgotten. He had wondered how the German women would react to their first American meal. What he witnessed was not what he expected. These were not hardened enemy soldiers sneering at their captors' hospitality. These were hungry, frightened young women whose entire understanding of the world was beginning to shift with every bite of fried chicken they took. That first night after dinner, the women lay in their cots, unable to sleep. Their bodies were exhausted, but their minds raced with questions that had no easy answers. Greta stared at the ceiling, her stomach full for the first time in months, yet that fullness brought no comfort. Instead, it brought confusion and a creeping sense of betrayal, though she could not identify who had betrayed whom. She had been told that Americans were wasteful and cruel, that they hoarded resources while the world starved, that they treated prisoners with calculated brutality designed to break spirits and extract information. Yet the meal she had just eaten contradicted every element of that narrative. The chicken had been prepared with care, seasoned with attention to flavor rather than simply boiled for sustenance. The portions had been identical to what the American soldiers received, suggesting no hierarchy of privilege between captors and captives. Most troubling of all, the kitchen staff had served them without hostility, without making them feel less than human. Beside her, Liesel whispered in German, "Greta, why would they feed us like that? What do they want from us?" It was the question they were all thinking, but afraid to voice. In their experience, kindness always came with conditions, with expectations of something in return. But what could these Americans possibly want from a group of captured auxiliary workers? They possessed no valuable intelligence, no military secrets worth extracting. They were, in the grand scheme of the war, utterly insignificant. Greta had no answer to give. She thought about the chicken, about how the crispy coating had crunched between her teeth, about the way the seasoning had lingered on her tongue long after she swallowed. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Munich, about the careful rationing that had defined the last years of her life in Germany. Butter had become a luxury. Real coffee had disappeared. Meat had been reserved for special occasions, and even then the portions had been modest. Yet here in an enemy prison camp, she had eaten better than she had eaten at her own family table in years. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. How could the enemy feed their prisoners so well? How could the people her government had described as barbaric and uncivilized produce food that spoke of abundance and generosity? The questions spiraled through her mind, each one undermining another piece of the worldview she had constructed over years of Nazi propaganda and wartime desperation. She heard quiet crying from other cots in the darkness. Some women wept from homesickness, from fear of an uncertain future, but others, Greta suspected, cried from the same confusion that kept her awake. They had crossed an ocean expecting one reality and had instead encountered something that made no sense within the framework they had been given for understanding the world. Tomorrow they would wake in this strange place and face another day of captivity. Tomorrow there would be another meal in that mess hall. And with each meal, each small kindness, each moment that contradicted what they had been taught, the foundation of their beliefs would crack a little more. Greta was not sure she was ready for what would happen when those cracks became too wide to ignore. Morning came with a bell that rang across the compound at 6 o'clock. The women rose stiffly from their cots, their bodies still adjusting to the thin mattresses and the humid Mississippi heat that was so different from the climates most of them had known. They dressed in the same gray uniforms they had worn for days, self-conscious about their appearance, but having no alternatives. Corporal Bauer arrived to escort them to the mess hall for breakfast. The walk through the compound in daylight revealed more details about their new environment. American soldiers moved with purpose, but without the harsh urgency that had characterized German military operations in the final chaotic months of the war. The camp felt organized but not oppressive, disciplined but not cruel. The breakfast line operated the same way dinner had the previous evening. The women received metal trays and moved past kitchen staff who served generous portions without comment. This morning, There were scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, toast with jam, and fresh coffee that smelled richer than anything Greta had encountered in years. The abundance continued to disorient her, to challenge everything she thought she understood about wartime scarcity and enemy intentions. As the women settled at their usual table in the back corner of the mess hall, something unexpected happened. Private Robert Chen, a young soldier of Chinese descent from California, approached their table carrying his own breakfast tray. He gestured politely and asked in English if he could sit with them. The women stared at him in confusion and alarm. Corporal Bauer, who was eating at a nearby table, came over to translate. The private's request was simple and startling. He wanted to practice his German. He had been studying the language before the war and thought this might be an opportunity to improve his conversational skills. In exchange, he offered to help them with their English. The women exchanged uncertain glances. This violated every expectation they had about the distance that should exist between prisoners and guards. Yet Private Chen's expression showed only friendly interest, no trace of ulterior motive or mockery. Greta, making a decision that surprised even herself, nodded permission. The young soldier sat down at the end of their table and began attempting simple German phrases. His pronunciation was terrible, his grammar worse, but his genuine effort and good-natured willingness to make mistakes slowly eased the tension. Other soldiers took notice. Over the following days, more Americans began sitting near the German women's table, not crowding them but making their presence less threatening through familiarity. Conversations started hesitantly, mediated through Corporal Bauer or the few women who had studied English in school. They talked about simple things at first, the weather, the food, neutral topics that required no political positioning or ideological defense. But even these surface-level exchanges began to humanize both groups to each other. The American soldiers learned that these German women were not fanatical Nazis, but ordinary young people who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their control. The German women discovered that Americans were not the monsters they had been taught to fear, but individuals with families and homes and dreams not so different from their own. The second Sunday at Camp Shelby brought another revelation that would deepen the transformation already beginning in the German women's understanding of their situation. Captain Morrison had arranged for a special meal, a tradition he explained was common in the American South. Sunday dinner, he told them through Corporal Bauer, was a time for communities to gather and share their best cooking, a weekly celebration that honored both faith and fellowship. The mess hall smelled different that afternoon, richer and more complex than the daily meals had been. When the women moved through the serving line, they discovered the source of those smells. The kitchen staff had prepared what they called Sunday fried chicken, a meal that Private Morrison explained with obvious pride was a cornerstone of Southern hospitality. The chicken pieces were larger than what they had received before, the coating darker and more heavily spiced. Alongside it came dishes with unfamiliar names, collard greens cooked with bits of smoked meat, cornbread still warm from the oven with honey butter, something called mac and cheese that looked like pasta but tasted like nothing Greta had ever encountered in German cuisine, and for dessert, thick slices of pecan pie topped with fresh cream. Greta sat with her tray and felt something inside her begin to break. This was not prison food. This was not even ordinary food. This was celebration food, the kind of meal families prepared for special occasions, for holidays and gatherings of loved ones. Yet here she sat, an enemy, prisoner, being served this meal by people who had every reason to hate her and everything she represented. Liesel spoke quietly in German, her voice thick with emotion. My grandmother used to make special meals on Sundays. Before the war, before the rationing, she would spend all morning in the kitchen and we would gather as a family. She looked down at her plate. This feels like that. How can that be? How can our enemies make us feel like family? It was the question that haunted all of them now. The food had become more than sustenance. It had become a language of its own, communicating things that words could not adequately express. Every generous portion, every carefully prepared dish, every instance of American abundance shared without hesitation spoke of values that contradicted the propaganda they had absorbed for years. Across the table, Maria Schneider, a 31-year-old former clerk from Berlin, set down her fork with trembling hands. I volunteered for the Kriegshelferinnen because I believed the stories about American aggression, about how they wanted to destroy German culture and starve our people. But if they wanted us to starve, why do they feed us like this? Her voice carried a note of angry confusion, as if she felt betrayed by the very people who were showing her kindness. What if everything we were told was a lie? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. To admit that the propaganda had been false meant admitting that they had served a cause built on deception. It meant confronting the possibility that their sacrifices, their service, their belief in defending the fatherland had all been in service of something fundamentally wrong. The Sunday chicken sat on their plates. Delicious and damning, evidence that could not be argued away or rationalized into compliance with their old worldview. October brought the first mail delivery to the German women prisoners at Camp Shelby. The International Red Cross had been working to establish contact between prisoners of war and their families, a process complicated by the chaos of the European theater and the systematic destruction of German infrastructure. When Corporal Bauer arrived at the barracks with a small stack of letters, the women gathered around him with desperate hope and terrible fear in equal measure. Only 7 letters had made it through. 7 connections to a past that seemed increasingly distant, with each day spent in American captivity. Greta's name was called, and she accepted an envelope with shaking hands. The paper was thin and worn, the address written in her mother's careful script. She moved to her cot and sat down, holding the letter for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. When she finally unfolded the pages inside, her mother's words painted a picture of devastation that made Greta's chest tighten with grief and guilt. Munich had been bombed repeatedly. Their neighborhood was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. Her mother's and younger sister were living in the cellar of what remained of a church, sharing space with dozens of other displaced families. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. Her father's whereabouts remained unknown since his unit had been sent east months earlier. Her brother Klaus had been killed in France just weeks before the letter was written. He was 17 years old. Greta read the words again and again, trying to make them make sense. Klaus was dead. Her childhood home was destroyed. Her family was starving in a cellar while she sat in an American prison camp eating fried chicken and fresh bread. The juxtaposition felt obscene, impossible to reconcile. Around her, other women were opening their own letters or standing empty-handed, no news having reached them at all. Liesel had received word that her entire village had been evacuated, her family's fate unknown. Maria learned that her husband had been killed in Italy. The letters shattered any remaining illusions about what awaited them if they returned to Germany. There was no home to return to, no intact life waiting to be resumed. Everything they had known was gone or irrevocably changed. That evening in the mess hall, the usual Sunday dinner sat before them, but the women could barely eat. The contrast between American abundance and German desperation had been abstract before, something they could discuss and debate. Now it was personal and immediate, written in their mother's handwriting. Greta pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. She thought about Klaus, about the last time she had seen him in his new uniform, so proud to be serving the Reich. He had been just a boy playing at being a soldier. Now he was dead, and she was alive, well-fed and safe, in enemy captivity, while her family starved in ruins. The guilt was crushing, made worse by the kindness of her captors. Sergeant William Hayes had been cooking in the Army for 12 years before the war started. Black man from Louisiana, who had learned his craft at his grandmother's side, he had joined the military when civilian opportunities remained limited by the color of his skin. The kitchen was his domain, and he ran it with the efficiency of a general and the artistry of someone who understood that food could communicate things words never could. He had noticed the German women from their first day in the mess hall. He saw how they ate with the desperate hunger of people who had known real scarcity, how their eyes widened at portions they clearly had not expected to receive. But after the letters arrived from Germany, he noticed something else. He saw how they pushed food around their plates, how guilt had stolen their appetites even as their bodies still needed nourishment. On a Thursday morning in late October, Sergeant Hayes made a decision. He asked Captain Morrison for permission to do something unusual, something that had never been done in any prisoner of war camp he knew of. He wanted to teach the German women how to cook American food. The captain was skeptical at first, concerned about security and propriety. But Sergeant Hayes was persuasive. These women needed purpose, he argued, something to focus on besides their grief and guilt. And teaching them a skill, showing them that their captors saw them as people worth investing in, might help with whatever came next for them. Permission was granted with strict supervision requirements. The following Sunday, Sergeant Hayes asked Corporal Bauer to translate an invitation to the German women. Any who were interested could come to the kitchen after breakfast to learn how to prepare proper Southern fried chicken. Greta was surprised when she found herself volunteering. She had never been particularly interested in cooking back home, but something about the offer appealed to her. Perhaps it was the chance to do something with her hands, to create rather than simply consume. Perhaps it was curiosity about the food that had become such a central part of her transformation. Or perhaps it was the way Sergeant Hayes looked at them, not as enemies or prisoners, but as students he genuinely wanted to teach. 6 women gathered in the kitchen that Sunday. Sergeant Hayes showed them how to prepare the chicken, how to season the flour coating with the right combination of salt, pepper, and his secret spices. He demonstrated the proper temperature for the oil, the timing that would produce that perfect golden crust. He taught them with patience and respect, correcting their mistakes without condescension, praising their successes without patronizing them. As Greta worked alongside the man who had fed her these past weeks, she realized something profound was happening. In this kitchen, wearing their enemy uniforms, they were being treated not as prisoners to be guarded, but as people worthy of knowledge, worthy of his time and expertise. The cooking lessons became a weekly ritual. Every Sunday after breakfast, the same 6 women gathered in the Sergeant Hayes's kitchen to learn new dishes and techniques. They progressed from fried chicken to biscuits and gravy, from cornbread to collard greens, from sweet potato pie to red beans and rice. Each lesson was more than just instruction in cooking. It was an education in a culture they had been taught to despise, but were learning to appreciate in ways that confused and challenged them. Greta discovered she had a natural talent for baking. Her biscuits rose light and fluffy, earning rare praise from Sergeant Hayes, who was notoriously difficult to impress. Liesel excelled at the delicate timing required for perfect fried chicken, developing an instinct for when each piece had reached that ideal moment of crispy exterior and tender interior. The other women found their own strengths, their own connections to this culinary tradition so different from what they had known in Germany. But the lessons taught more than cooking skills. Sergeant Hayes shared stories as they worked, tales of his grandmother's kitchen in Louisiana, of Sunday dinners that brought together extended family and neighbors, regardless of their circumstances. He spoke about the history embedded in Southern food, about how enslaved people had created extraordinary dishes from the scraps they were given, how they had transformed suffering into art through the alchemy of seasoning and technique. He talked about resilience and creativity, about finding dignity and joy even in the darkest circumstances. The women listened as they chopped vegetables and seasoned meat, as they learned to judge oil temperature by the bubble around a wooden spoon handle, and to test biscuit dough by its texture rather than precise measurements. They began to understand that Sergeant Hayes was teaching them something more profound than recipes. He was showing them that humanity could persist through hardship, that culture and identity could survive attempts to destroy them, that food prepared with care and shared with generosity could heal wounds that seemed too deep to ever close. One Sunday in November, after they had finished preparing a complete meal under his supervision, Sergeant Hayes did something unexpected. He invited them to sit down and eat what they had cooked, right there in the kitchen, alongside him and the other kitchen staff. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented a boundary crossed. They were no longer just prisoners being fed by their captors. They were cooks sharing a meal they had prepared together, momentarily equals in the universal human ritual of breaking bread. Greta sat at that kitchen table with a plate of food she had helped create and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She thought about her mother in that cellar in Munich, about Klaus buried in French soil, about everything that had been lost. But she also thought about this moment, about the unexpected grace of being taught and trusted by a man who had every historical reason to show them no kindness at all. December arrived with cooler weather that felt more familiar to the German women than Mississippi's autumn heat had been. The compound took on a different character as American soldiers prepared for Christmas, decorating common areas with wreaths and lights that seemed extravagant given the war still raging in the Pacific. The German women watched these preparations with mixed emotions, remembering Christmases past in their own country, wondering what holidays would look like for their families struggling in occupied Germany. Sergeant Hayes approached Greta with a proposal that caught her completely off guard. He wanted the women who had been learning to cook to prepare the Christmas dinner for the entire camp, German prisoners and American soldiers alike. It would be a massive undertaking, cooking for over 300 people, but he believed they were ready. More importantly, he believed it would give them something meaningful to contribute, a way to participate in the community rather than simply existing on its margins. Greta brought the proposal to the other women in the cooking group. The reactions were mixed. Some were excited by the opportunity, eager to demonstrate what they had learned and to give something back to the soldiers who had treated them with unexpected decency. Others were hesitant, worried about how it would be perceived if German prisoners prepared an American holiday meal. Would it seem like collaboration, like betrayal of their own country and people? Maria, who had lost her husband and received no further word from her family in Berlin, spoke with quiet intensity about what the opportunity meant to her. For months, she had felt useless, a burden being kept alive by enemy generosity she had no way to repay. The chance to cook, to create something that would bring pleasure to others, felt like a path back to human dignity she had thought forever lost. After lengthy discussion, the 6 women agreed. They would prepare Christmas dinner under Sergeant Hayes's supervision. The menu would be ambitious, traditional Southern holiday fare on a scale none of them had attempted before. Fried chicken remained the centerpiece, but they would also prepare ham, glazed with brown sugar and cloves, cornbread dressing with sage and onions, collard greens and black-eyed peas for good fortune, sweet potato casserole, and pecan pie for dessert. The days leading up to Christmas became a whirlwind of preparation. The women worked alongside American kitchen staff, following Sergeant Hayes's careful instructions and detailed planning. They peeled potatoes until their hands cramped, chopped onions until tears streamed down their faces for reasons that had nothing to do with the onions, seasoned enormous quantities of flour for the chicken coating, and learned to manage multiple dishes, cooking simultaneously in the large industrial kitchen. Captain Morrison watched the preparations with growing admiration. These women had arrived at Camp Shelby broken and defeated, expecting cruelty and receiving kindness they did not know how to process. Now they worked with purpose and skill, creating something beautiful from their unlikely circumstances. He understood that something remarkable was happening in his camp, something that transcended the simple categories of prisoner and guard, enemy and ally. Christmas morning 1944 dawned clear and cold over Camp Shelby. The German women rose before sunrise to begin final preparations for the dinner they would serve that afternoon. The kitchen was warm from ovens already heating, filled with the mingled scents of spices and roasting meat that made the holiday feel real, despite everything that separated this Christmas from the ones they had known before the war. Greta stood at the preparation table, coating chicken pieces in seasoned flour, her movements now practiced and confident after weeks of learning from Sergeant Hayes. Beside her, Liesel carefully arranged pieces in the hot oil, watching for that perfect golden color that signaled they were ready to turn. The other women moved through their assigned tasks with quiet efficiency, each one focused on executing their part of the elaborate meal they had planned. As they worked, Corporal Bauer translated Christmas carols playing on the radio in the corner. Some songs were familiar, melodies the women recognized even with English words they could not fully understand. Others were distinctly American, foreign, but not unpleasant in their unfamiliarity. The music created a bridge between two cultures, two nations still technically at war, yet here in this kitchen, finding common ground in the universal language of celebration and shared effort. By early afternoon, the mess hall had been transformed. Tables were arranged in long rows, decorated with pine branches and red ribbons. American soldiers began gathering, their usual casual demeanor replaced with the special anticipation that comes with holiday meals. They knew that German prisoners had prepared the dinner, and curiosity mixed with appreciation for the effort these women had made. When the time came to serve, the German women carried platters of food from the kitchen to the serving line. Greta watched American soldiers' faces as they saw the spread before them. She saw surprise at the quantity and quality, saw appreciation for the traditional dishes that reminded many of home and family. She saw something else too, a recognition that transcended the circumstances of war. These men understood that the women who had cooked this meal had given them a gift, had offered something more valuable than mere food. Captain Morrison stood and called for attention before the meal began. Through Corporal Bauer, he thanked the German women for their work and their willingness to share in this holiday celebration. His words were simple but sincere, acknowledging the strangeness of the situation while honoring the humanity that had emerged despite it. The women returned to their usual table, but this time, several American soldiers asked if they could join them. The meal became a shared experience, conversations flowing in broken English and halting German, laughter rising over linguistic barriers as people discovered they could communicate joy and fellowship even without perfect understanding of each other's words. The success of Christmas dinner changed the dynamics in Camp Shelby in ways both subtle and profound. The German women were no longer simply prisoners being housed and fed. They had become contributors, participants in the life of the camp, rather than passive recipients of their captors' decisions. Sergeant Hayes formalized the cooking arrangement, making the 6 women regular members of his kitchen staff with specific responsibilities and schedules that gave structure and purpose to their days. In January 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and news from Europe grew increasingly grim, the kitchen became a sanctuary for difficult conversations. Working side by side with American soldiers, speaking in the shorthand that develops between people who share daily tasks, the German women began to confront truths they had been avoiding since their capture. It was during these kitchen shifts that Greta finally spoke aloud something she had been thinking for months. She was peeling potatoes alongside Private Chen, the young soldier who had first sat at their table back in September. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar task as she struggled to find English words for thoughts she had barely allowed herself to form in German. Private Chen, she began hesitantly, in Germany, we were told Americans were cruel people, that you wanted to destroy us, to take everything from us. She paused, setting down her peeling knife to look directly at him. but here you feed us better than we fed ourselves at home. You teach us and trust us in your kitchen. Why?" The young soldier considered the question carefully before responding. He spoke slowly, knowing she was still learning English, choosing his words with care. "My parents came to America from China. They faced discrimination and hardship. But they also found opportunity and kindness from unexpected places." He gestured around the kitchen. "This is what America is supposed to be. A place where people get second chances, where your past does not have to define your future." Liesel, working nearby, had been listening. She added her own confession. "We believed such terrible things about you, about all Americans." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "We thought we were defending our country from monsters, but we were the ones serving the monsters." The words hung heavy in the kitchen air. Other workers had stopped their tasks to listen, sensing the importance of what was being said. Maria spoke next, her voice rough with emotion. "My husband died believing he was fighting for something noble. Now I read about the camps, about what Germany did." She struggled to continue. "How do we live with knowing we were part of that? Even if we did not know, we were still part of it." Sergeant Hayes, who had been supervising at the stove, turned to face the women. His expression was serious but not unkind. "You live with it by being different now, by choosing to be better than what you were taught. None of us can change the past, but we can decide what kind of people we will be going forward." February 1945 brought news that made the future impossible to ignore any longer. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, the war in Europe was entering its final phase, and everyone at Camp Shelby understood that the day was approaching when decisions would have to be made about the German prisoners' fate. Repatriation procedures were being discussed in Washington, plans forming for the massive logistical challenge of returning thousands of prisoners to a defeated and occupied Germany. The German women felt the weight of this approaching deadline in every conversation, every shared meal, every moment in the kitchen where they had found unexpected purpose. Greta lay awake at night, wrestling with questions that seemed to have no good answers. Should she return to Munich to search for her mother and sister in the ruins? Should she stay in America if given the choice, even though it meant abandoning her family in their time of greatest need? How could she choose between duty and survival, between loyalty and the life she had begun to build in this strange place? Sergeant Hayes noticed the tension building among his kitchen workers. Their movements became mechanical again, the joy that had emerged during the Christmas preparations fading as they contemplated separation from the community they had unexpectedly joined. He decided to address the situation directly, calling the 6 women together one afternoon after the lunch service had ended. He asked them to sit at the kitchen table where they had shared so many meals and conversations over the past months. What he proposed was both simple and revolutionary. He wanted to create a cookbook, a collection of the recipes they had learned together, with notes about the techniques and stories behind each dish. It would be something tangible they could take with them wherever they went, a record of their time at Camp Shelby and the skills they had acquired. More importantly, it would be a bridge between their past and future, between Germany and America, between who they had been and who they were becoming. The women embraced the project with an enthusiasm that surprised even Sergeant Hayes. They began meeting every evening to work on the cookbook, carefully writing out recipes in both German and English, adding detailed instructions and personal observations. Greta discovered she had a talent for describing cooking processes clearly, translating Sergeant Hayes's intuitive knowledge into precise, written directions. Liesel drew careful illustrations showing proper chicken coating techniques and the ideal color for fried pieces. Maria wrote about the history and significance of each dish, connecting Southern food traditions to larger stories about resilience and creativity in the face of hardship. The cookbook became more than a collection of recipes. It became a testament to transformation, a document proving that even enemies could learn from each other, that cultural exchange could happen in the most unlikely circumstances. Each page represented hours of work in the kitchen, conversations that had bridged divides, moments of connection that had seemed impossible when they first arrived as frightened prisoners expecting cruelty and finding kindness instead. March arrived with official word from Washington. All German prisoners of war would begin repatriation procedures within 60 days. The announcement came during a general assembly that included both American personnel and German prisoners. Captain Morrison read the orders in a steady voice that betrayed none of his personal feelings about the situation. Then Corporal Bauer translated into German for those who still struggled with English. The women sat in shocked silence as the reality settled over them. 60 days, 2 months to prepare for separation from everything they had built at Camp Shelby, from the people who had become more than captors, from the life that had given them purpose when they had expected only to survive until some distant moment when they could return home. But the announcement included an unexpected element. Due to the chaotic conditions in occupied Germany, prisoners could voluntarily delay their repatriation for up to 6 months if they had compelling reasons. Those who chose to delay would be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. A change in legal status that would allow them more freedom, but also remove the guarantees of housing and support that came with POW status. After the assembly, the German women gathered in their barracks to discuss what the announcement meant for each of them. The conversation was heated and emotional, revealing how differently they had each processed their months in captivity. Some were eager to return immediately despite the uncertainties, feeling that duty demanded they go back to help rebuild their shattered country. Others were terrified of leaving the security and community they had found at Camp Shelby, uncertain whether they could survive in the chaos of occupied Germany. Greta found herself unable to articulate her own feelings. Part of her desperately wanted to search for her mother and sister, to fulfill her obligations as a daughter, even if it meant returning to ruins and starvation. But another part of her recognized that she had changed in fundamental ways during her time in America. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, had formed connections that felt more real than many relationships she had known before the war. She had learned that enemies could become teachers, that kindness could come from unexpected sources, that identity was not fixed, but could evolve through choices and experiences. Liesel was the first to say aloud what several of them were thinking. What if we asked to delay? What if we requested the 6-month extension? Her voice was tentative, as if testing dangerous ground. The room fell silent. To voluntarily delay repatriation felt like admitting they preferred captivity to freedom, preferred their enemies' company to their own people's. Yet, that was exactly what some of them felt, even if they could barely admit it to themselves. Maria spoke next, her words careful and measured. In Germany, I have nothing left. My husband is dead. My home is destroyed. My city is occupied by foreign soldiers. Here I have work that matters. I have learned skills that give me value. I have found reasons to keep living instead of simply surviving. The deadline for deciding about repatriation delay came at the end of March. Each German prisoner had to submit a written statement indicating whether they would accept immediate repatriation or request the 6-month extension. The choice was individual, but the women in the kitchen group found themselves meeting repeatedly to discuss their options, each seeking validation or challenge for the decision taking shape in her own heart. Greta spent hours writing and rewriting her statement. She tried to articulate why she wanted to delay, to explain without seeming disloyal to her homeland or ungrateful to her family. She described her work in the kitchen, the skills she had acquired, the cookbook project that was nearing completion. She wrote about wanting to save money from her kitchen wages to send to her mother once mail services were fully restored. She argued that she could help her family more by staying in America, temporarily, then by returning immediately to compete for scarce resources in occupied Germany. But beneath these practical justifications lay deeper truths she struggled to express. She had found something at Camp Shelby that she did not want to lose, a sense of possibility and purpose that had been absent from her life even before the war. She had discovered that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined, that her identity was not limited to the narrow roles her society had prescribed. She had learned that people she had been taught to hate could see value in her that she had not seen in herself. Liesel's decision came more easily. She had no family waiting for her in Germany. Her parents had died before the war, her village had been destroyed, and she had no siblings or close relatives she knew of. For her, returning to Germany meant returning to nothing and no one. Staying in America, even temporarily, meant staying with people who knew her name, who valued her contributions, who had given her reasons to believe in a future worth working toward. Maria wrestled with guilt that made her decision agonizing despite its clarity. She knew she wanted to stay, knew that returning to Berlin would destroy what fragile stability she had rebuilt in herself. But she felt she was betraying her husband's memory, abandoning her duty to the country he had died defending, choosing comfort over honor. Sergeant Hayes found her crying in the kitchen one evening and sat beside her without saying anything for several minutes. When she finally explained her conflict, he offered perspective shaped by his own experience as a black man in America. Sometimes staying and building something new is braver than going back to what is familiar. Sometimes honor means choosing life and growth over loyalty to death and destruction. Your husband would want you to live, to have a future. That is how you honor his memory. On the day the statements were due, 5 of the 6 women from the kitchen group submitted requests to delay their repatriation. Only one chose immediate return, a woman who had recently learned that her children had survived and were living with relatives in Bavaria. The others committed themselves to 6 more months in America. 6 months to continue learning and working, 6 months to prepare for an uncertain future that felt more full of possibility than the certain devastation awaiting them in Germany. April 1945 brought victory in Europe and the formal end of the war that had shaped every aspect of the German women's lives for years. The news arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, spreading through Camp Shelby with shouts and celebrations that the German prisoners observed from a distance. They understood the joy, but could not fully share it. For the Americans, this was triumph, vindication of sacrifice and struggle. For the German women, it was defeat, the final confirmation that everything they had believed about their country's invincibility had been a lie. The mood in the kitchen was somber as they prepared dinner that evening. Greta moved through familiar tasks with mechanical precision, her mind replaying memories of Klaus in his uniform, of her father's proud face when she had joined the Kriegshelferinnen, of rallies and speeches that had promised glory and delivered only devastation. Victory in Europe meant her country was broken beyond recognition, occupied by the very enemies who had shown her more kindness than her own government ever had. Sergeant Hayes recognized the need for something to mark this moment, something that acknowledged both celebration and grief. He proposed preparing a special meal, not to celebrate victory, but to honor transition, to recognize that the world was changing, and everyone in Camp Shelby would be changed with it. The women agreed, grateful for a task that gave structure to overwhelming emotions. They decided to prepare the dishes they had mastered over months of learning, a greatest hits collection of Southern cooking that represented their entire journey from frightened prisoners to skilled kitchen workers. Fried chicken remained the centerpiece, golden and perfectly seasoned. Around it, they arranged cornbread and collard greens, mac and cheese, and sweet potato casserole, biscuits with honey butter, and pecan pie for dessert. As they cooked, they talked about what victory meant and what would come next. The war's end made their delayed repatriation more complicated. They were no longer prisoners of war from an active enemy, but displaced persons from a defeated nation. Their legal status would change, their options would shift, and the 6-month delay they had requested would be spent in circumstances none of them could fully predict. That evening, the mess hall filled with American soldiers in high spirits, celebrating the end of fighting in Europe, even as war continued in the Pacific. But when the German women carried out platters of food they had prepared, something shifted in the atmosphere. Soldiers who had been laughing and joking fell quiet as they recognized the gesture being made. Captain Morrison stood once again to address the assembled group. Through Corporal Bauer, he acknowledged the complicated emotions of the day, the victory that was also tragedy, the end that was also beginning. He thanked the German women for their work and their willingness to mark this moment with grace and dignity, despite everything it meant for their own futures and their own people. May brought the departure of German prisoners who had chosen immediate repatriation. Over the course of 2 weeks, transport trucks arrived to carry groups of women to port cities where ships waited to take them back across the Atlantic to a homeland many no longer recognized as home. The 5 women from the kitchen group who had chosen to stay watched their fellow prisoners prepare to leave with emotions that ranged from guilt to relief to profound uncertainty about whether they had made the right choice. The night before the first transport departed, the kitchen group organized a farewell dinner for those who were leaving. They prepared familiar German dishes this time, recipes they remembered from before the war that they had recreated using American ingredients. The result was food that tasted almost like home, but not quite, flavored with memory and longing, and the recognition that home itself had become something impossible to return to unchanged. Women who had barely spoken to each other during the first weeks of captivity now embraced with genuine affection, promising to write if mail service allowed, to search for each other if they ever returned to Germany. They exchanged addresses that might no longer be valid, names of relatives who might not have survived, scraps of information that represented fragile threads of connection across an uncertain future. Greta gave each departing woman a handwritten copy of selected recipes from the cookbook they had created. She included notes about techniques and her own observations, but also personal messages about what their time together had meant, about the lessons she had learned from watching them navigate impossible choices with courage and dignity. The women who were leaving carried these recipe pages carefully, folding them into pockets and tucking them into bags alongside their few other possessions. Some cried as they read Greta's words, recognizing that these recipes represented more than instructions for preparing food. They were evidence that transformation was possible, that enemies could become friends, that kindness could exist even in captivity. When the transport trucks finally departed, the remaining women stood at the fence watching until the vehicles disappeared from sight. The compound felt emptier, quieter, as if something essential had been removed, even though the physical space remained unchanged. That evening, the kitchen group gathered around their usual table, 5 women, now instead of 6, facing 6 months of continued displacement before they would have to make final decisions about their futures. Sergeant Hayes joined them with the completed cookbook, professionally bound with a simple cover that read, "Recipes for Reconciliation," in both English and German. He presented it to Greta as the project's primary author, but made clear it belonged to all of them equally, a shared creation that documented their collective journey. They paged through it together, reading recipes aloud, remembering moments associated with each dish. The fried chicken that had started everything, the Christmas dinner that had transformed them from prisoners into contributors, the countless meals they had prepared that had fed not just bodies, but also the possibility of hope and redemption in circumstances that should have produced only bitterness and despair. The 6 months passed quickly for those who remained. Summer brought oppressive Mississippi heat that the German women learned to navigate with the same adaptability they had shown in learning Southern cooking. They continued working in the kitchen, but their status had changed as promised. They were no longer prisoners, but displaced persons, technically free to leave the camp, though they had nowhere else to go and no resources to establish themselves independently. Captain Morrison worked to help them navigate this limbo, connecting them with organizations that assisted refugees and displaced persons, exploring possibilities for extended stays or even permanent immigration if they chose that path. Greta found herself considering options she had never imagined possible. Sergeant Hayes had written letters of recommendation describing her skills and work ethic. A restaurant owner in Jackson had expressed interest in hiring her. A family in Memphis had offered housing in exchange for help with cooking and childcare. The possibilities were simultaneously exciting and terrifying, requiring her to imagine a future in America that extended beyond temporary displacement. By October 1945, final decisions could no longer be delayed. The women had to choose whether to accept repatriation to Germany or pursue the complicated process of remaining in America permanently. Mail service had been restored, and Greta had been corresponding with her mother in Munich. The letters painted a grim picture of conditions in occupied Germany, but also conveyed her mother's fierce insistence that she was surviving, that she and Greta's sister would endure whatever hardships came. Reading those letters, Greta understood that her mother would survive whether she returned or not. The question was what kind of life she wanted to build for herself, what kind of person she wanted to become. She thought about the frightened woman who had arrived at Camp Shelby a year earlier, rigid with propaganda and convinced of her own righteousness. She thought about everything she had learned in Sergeant Hayes's kitchen, about resilience and transformation, about choosing different values than those she had been taught. In November, 4 of the 5 remaining kitchen workers chose to stay in America. They began the complex immigration process, sponsored by families and organizations that had witnessed their transformation. Only Liesel decided to return to Germany, not because she had family waiting, but because she felt called to help rebuild, to carry back lessons about reconciliation and human dignity. On the day she left, she carried her copy of the cookbook and a letter from Sergeant Hayes. Years later, scholars would study this case of German women POWs transformed by American kindness. But for Greta, standing in a Mississippi kitchen teaching another displaced person how to properly season fried chicken, the legacy was simpler. She had learned that identity was not fixed, that enemies could become teachers, that a single meal prepared with care could crack open hearts closed by hatred. The fried chicken that had shocked her that first evening had become a symbol of everything America had taught her about second chances and building new lives from the ruins of old beliefs.